chapter. Babu Sujud al-Tilawa, the chapter about the verses or the prostrations of recitation. So we talk about those Quranic verses. Once you read them or hear them, whether intentionally or unintentionally, you have to perform a sajda. It becomes wajib. في القرآن 14 sajda. There are 14 places in the Quran in which if you read or hear them, you have to perform the sajda. 4 of these verses come in the first half of the Quran, the first 15 juz, and the 10 other verses come in the second half of the Quran, in the last 15 ajza. What are those places? Number 1, في آخر الأعراف, at the end of Surah Al-A'raf, verse 206 to be precise. The second is in Surah Al-Ra'd, verse 15. The third is in Surah Al-Nahl, verse 50. The fourth is in Surah Bani Israel, and that is verse 109. The fifth is in Surah Maryam, verse 58. The sixth is the first ayatul sajda in Surah Al-Hajj. And Surah Al-Hajj is a verse in which if you look at the Mus'haf, it has 2 sajdas in it. One at the very end of the surah and one a little before that, right? And if you look close at the footnotes of the last sajda, the second sajda in Surah Al-Hajj, it says sajdatul shafi'i, because the last sajda in Surah so there are 14 sajdas. We and the madhab of Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, we agree on the number of sajdas, which is 14. But what 14 sajdas are there? What are those 14 verses? There is ikhtilaf in one of these sujood. That is, we say that there is a sajda in Surah Al-Sad and only one sajda in Surah Al-Hajj, while Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala says that there are 2 sujood in Surah Al-Hajj and no sujood in Surah Al-Sad, which comes in the 23rd juz, right? So that's a minor ikhtilaf between the two of us. But if someone is willing to perform, being a Hanafi, the second sujood in Surah Al-Hajj, by all means, please go ahead. There's nothing wrong with that. So number 6 was the first sajda in Surah Al-Hajj. On number 7, you have Surah Al-Furqan. Oh, and by the way, it's in verse 77 in Surah Al-Hajj. The sajda is in ayah verse 77. In Surah Al-Furqan, it is verse number 60. Then you have number 8, Surah Al-Naml. Which is verse 25. Then you have Surah Alif Lam Mim Tanzil in the 21st chapter, which is verse number 15. Then you have on number 10, Surah Sad, verse 24. On 11, you have Surah Hamim Sajda, verse 38. And then you have Surah Al-Najm at number 12, which is verse 62. And the last to come in the last juz, in juz 30, Amma, which is Surah Al-Inshiqaq, verse 21, and Surah Al-Alaq, the last verse, verse number 19. So these are the 14 places. If a person comes across them, whether reciting them themselves or hearing it intentionally or unintentionally, they have to perform the sujood. Now we talk about the hukm sajda. What is the ruling on this prostration? والسجود واجب في هذه المواضع على التالي والسامع سواء قصد سماع القرآن أو لم يقصد. Sajda becomes wajib on these people, whether reciting or listening, intentional or unintentional. وإذا تلا الإمام آية السجدة, if the imam recites آية السجدة, سجدها وسجد المأموم معه, he is going to prostrate for this, and so are the muqtadi'een, the followers behind him. Because the Prophet Islam, he mentioned as-sajda ala man sami'a wa la man talaha. Whoever listens to it and whoever recites it, both of them are obliged to make the sajda. And so if the imam's reciting it, and even if you can't hear the imam, but he is still reciting on your behalf, even in a silent prayer, the sajda will become wajib. So you just follow whatever the imam is doing. وَإِذَا تَلَا الْمَأْمُومِ لَمْ يَسْجُدِ الْإِمَامُ وَلَا الْمَأْمُومُ. But if, for example, during the jama'ah congregation, the muqtadi recites the verse, neither is it an obligation on the imam nor on the muqtadi to perform that sujud, neither inside of salah or even after finishing from your salah. Right? Uh, the reason why is the muqtadi is forbidden to recite behind the imam shar'an. The sharia forbids him from doing that. So you have the verse of the Quran which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِذَا قُرِيَ الْقُرْآنُ فَأَنصِتُوا. When the Quran is being recited in prayer, keep quiet and listen to it. Right? And so once the sharia forbids you from doing something, whatever you do against it, any legal implication of that does not apply. Right? So it won't hold any legal status. And so any legal ahkam relating to it will also be ineffective. وَلَوْ سَمِعَ رَجُلٌ خَارِجَ الصَّلَاةِ سَجَدَهَا. But if someone outside of the salah, for example, if that muqtadi recites the ayah out loud, and someone outside the salah, not part of the congregation, actually happens to hear him, he's going to have to make the sajda. Because for him, the recitation of the muqtadi is not actually of the muqtadi, because for that person, he's not a muqtadi, he's just some other person. So like in any other case, when listening to such a verse of the sajda becomes wajib, so will it become wajib on that person who is outside the salah and not part of it. And if the imam and the followers, they happen to hear the recitation of a person who is not part of the salah with them, right? Well, as long as they're in the prayer, they're not going to make sajda for that, but they will be required to make sajda for it after the salah. So for example, if you guys are praying in Jama and I'm passing by and reciting the Quran out loud, and I recite a verse of the sajda, Surah Al-Alaq, for example, and you happen to hear me while in your salah, at that point in time, you're not going to make the sujood tilawa because my recitation is not part of your salah. So you're not going to add something to your salah which is not part of it. But because you heard me reciting this verse, that obligation will stand in your zimma, in your responsibility, which you're going to have to perform once you're done with your salah. And if someone, they happen to do so inside their salah, they heard someone from the outside reciting the Quran, came across the ayah, and they performed that sajda inside their salah, that will not suffice. Right? They're going to have to do it again. You won't have to repeat the prayer, although you did something extra. So you can just do the sahab at the end. You don't need to repeat the entire prayer, but the sajda to talawa itself will have become void. So you have to do it again once you are done with your prayer. وَمَنْ تَلَا آيَةَ سَجْدَةٍ خَارِجَ الصَّلَاةِ وَلَمْ يَسْجُدْهَا. If someone recites a verse of prostration outside of prayer and yet they have not made the sajda yet, حَتَّى دَخَلَ فِي صَلَاةٍ, but then they, before performing this sajda, which became wajib on them, they enter a salah, فَطَلَاهَا وَسَجَدَ لَهَا. And what happens is that he recites the same surah and the same verse again in their salah. أجزأته السجدة عن التلاوتين, then that one sajda is going to suffice for both. For the tilawa he did outside of the salah and the tilawa he's doing inside of the salah, with the condition that it is the same ayah, it is the same surah. Because if, for example, outside he was reciting Surah Al-Swad and came across the sajda, and inside of salah he's performing Surah Al-Inshiqaq and comes across the ayah of sajda, they're two different verses. So they cannot be combined or made into one. And he's going to have to perform the sajda separately. But if it was the same surah, then that's this one sajda inside of the salah is going to be sufficient for the one outside of salah as well. وَإِن طَلَعَ فِي غَيْرِ الصَّلَاةِ, but if he recited outside the salah and then performed the sajda, ثُمَّ دَخَلَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ, then he entered prayer, فَطَلَاهَا, and he recited that again, سَجَدَهَا ثَانِيًا, he's going to have to make the sujood once again. وَلَمْ تُجْزِهِ السَّجْدَةُ الْأُولَى, the first sajda is not going to suffice for the second one because he's already performed the sajda, right? And once you perform the action, like the asbab, the reasons, the merits and warrants, they must come before the action. So once the action has been performed, any warrant sabab that's going to come afterwards is going to require another action to fulfill it. So if you've already made the sajda outside the salah and then you repeat that same verse inside of salah, a new warrant has been issued. There's a new sabab and that requires a new action. Right? وَمَنْ قَرَّ تَلَاوَةَ سَجْدَةٍ وَاحِدَةٍ فِي مَجْلِسٍ وَاحِدٍ أَجْزَأَتْهُ سَجْدَةٌ وَاحِدَةٍ. And so if you're in a single place reciting the same verse again and again, then one sajda is sufficient. So for those people who are doing tahfidh, for example, learning the Quran, memorizing it, if they're learning Surah Al-Alaq and they recite it in the same place, like even 100 times, then one sajda is sufficient for all of it. But if they keep changing their places, like you're in one room for one time you're reciting, on the other room when you're reciting, or for example, if you're traveling and you're constantly moving, your positions are changing, and you keep reciting, repeating, you need to have to make the sajda over and over again. Uh, a disclaimer about traveling is that if the vehicle is in your control, this will be counted as a change in majlis. So if you're actually driving and the majlis is changing, then you're going to have to make as many sajdas as many times as you recite. But if you're traveling by means in which it is not in your control, say, let's say you're traveling in the plane or in a ship, right? You can't stop your flight midair, right? And unless you're the captain of the ship, you can't have the ship stopped in the middle. A train would also be an example of this. So such traveling modes are considered as an extended majlis. So it's actually the same majlis altogether. So for example, while traveling from one city to another on a train, ship, or plane, you recite the same surah 100 times. You only have to make one sajda tilawa, and that should suffice. وَمَنْ أَرَادَ السُّجُودَ كَبَّرَ وَلَمْ يَرْفَعْ يَدَيْهِ. Now he's going to tell you how you're supposed to perform the sajda. Uh, Whoever intends to perform the prostration, he's going to say the takbir, lam yarfa yadayhi, no need to raise your hands, and no need to stand up. So if you're sitting down, just say the takbir, away sajada, and perform the sujood. Thumma qabbara, then you say the takbir again, warafa ra'sahu, and you raise your head up. Wala tashahhada alayhi wala salam, there's no tashahhud, and there's no salam. You just say the takbir, do the sajda, get up. While you're sitting down, while you're standing up. So if you need to make multiple sujood, you don't need to stand up each time. You can just go to the sujood once, say takbir again, go to the sujood, make as many as you require. Yep, and that should be sufficient. One question that normal people ask is, what are you supposed to recite in this sujood, in sujood tilawa? Well, you can perform any kind of dhikr you want. You could do it as in a normal salah. You could say Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. If you have memorized other adhkar, you can use them as well. Uh, One dhikr or dua in particular, some people recommend, even though it's not necessary, is to say Sajada wajhi lilladhi khalaqahu wa shaqqa sam'ahu wa basarahu bihawlihi wa quwwatihi. Ay sajada wajhiya lilladhi khalaqahu, that my face prostrates for the one who has created it. Wa shaqqa sam'ahu, and has opened pathways for hearing. Wa basarahu, and has opened pathways, and made the eyes to be able to see. Bihawlihi wa quwwatihi, with his strength and with his help. So that's something some people say that you can read. Acceptable. It is makruh to actually read an entire surah during the salah, and specifically leaving out the ayat sajda, right? So read the entire Surah Al-Alaq, you just leave the last ayah. That is makruh to do so, right? Because this gives the impression that you probably don't want to perform an extra sajda, right? So this istinkaf and sajda, this i'raz and sajda, this is something not what a moment would be doing, right? ولا بأس بأن يقرأ آية السجدة ويدع ما سواها. But for example, if you choose to specifically read just the ayah of sajda and leave everything else, that's okay. That's acceptable, because it doesn't give the impression that you're leaving an extra responsibility or wajib out for no reason. One other thing is when you are actually praying in the salah, and coincidentally, what happens is, or not even coincidentally, even if you choose to do so, is that the last ayah before the ruku that you are reciting is the verse of the sajda. You can make the intention of sajdatul tilawa in the ruku. So I'm reciting, I'm praying, and the last verse of my raka is at the last verse of Surah Alaq, for example, right? And before going to ruku, I make the intention of performing my sajdatul tilawa inside the ruku. That will suffice for my sajda, and I don't have to make a separate sajda altogether. And this is especially important to remember if you are the muqtadi, because the imam, he's going to recite and he will have the intention already. But what happens is the muqtadeen, and especially if you don't know the masla or don't remember the verses of the sajda, where they are and when they come. What could happen is the imam is going to say the ruku with the intention of the sajda. And in this case, the imam's intention does not count as the intention of the muqtadi. The muqtadi need their own intention. So the imam makes the intention, the muqtadi doesn't. Uh, and then they miss the sajda, because the sajda that becomes wajib in your salah, you have to perform it inside your salah. You cannot make the qaza of it outside. In other words, there is no qaza for sujood tilawa, which happens inside your salah. So this is a very important masala to remember, that you can actually intend to perform that sajda while you're performing the ruku. If you're praying individually, well, that's easy. But if you're praying in congregation, then this is something that you should keep in mind, because a lot of people tend to miss this.